Hey everyone, it is late at night and I am Norman. I recently stumbled upon a thread on Watch You Seek where people were telling crazy watch stories, or embarrassing watch stories, strange and weird watch stories, and I was thinking to myself, I should probably collect some others and do a video on watch stories. So here we are. So the first story that I have comes from that Watch You Seek article, and it's actually the story that I encountered that gave me the idea to do this video. And the story reads as follows. When I was in 6th grade, and one of my classmates' Casios developed a bad connection to the battery, it would randomly reset itself. Sometimes strange things would appear on the screen. One day it lost its connection and then came back up. But instead of resetting, it started beeping, and it would not stop beeping. He pushed the buttons, but nothing. He passed it around the room, and everyone tried pushing buttons to make it stop, but nope. It eventually beeped until the battery died. The next story was from that same thread, and I'm calling this one Be Free. And it reads as follows. August 1984. While on my honeymoon, I bought a brand new Rolex sub in the hotel gift shop for around $900. Had the AD remove 2 links and then went swimming in the ocean. Noticed it was missing off of my wrist about 30 minutes later. Total wrist time, approximately 2 hours plus $50 for the mask and fins that I bought to help look for it. Still have the box and papers, the links in storage, and I still wake up sometimes thinking that it was all just a bad dream. That is heartbreaking. The next story is from the same thread, and this one I'm giving the title, Boom. Back in the 90s, I was driving back to my office after buying a used Rolex. I was so busy looking at the watch on my wrist that I didn't see the huge rock in the road. I ran over it and ended up blowing out 2 tires. That kind of threw a wet blanket on the whole affair since I had just spent all my money on the watch. Now I just own 4 G-Shocks and I don't stress over them. This next story comes from Inside Hook, and I'm calling this one Stolen Space Watches. NASA issued and given to Don Eisel for his first Apollo mission in 1968 the Omega Speedster Professional Chronograph. And it was stolen from an Ecuadorian museum nearly 30 years ago. It's since been returned to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum after space history enthusiasts and authorities were able to track it down through watch shows and ultimately eBay. This particular speedster was engraved by NASA with its common identifier SEB 121-00039-002 and its unique serial number 34. But it's far from the first NASA watch that's been stolen. Most famously, Buzz Aldrin's Apollo 11 Speedster has been missing since 1970 when it disappeared while in transit to the Smithsonian. That's pretty crazy. I think I'd actually heard about Buzz's watch going missing, but wild that it's still MIA. The next story is from that same article, and I'm calling this one Dick Tracy Watch. So in 1997, a fisherman caught the body of a man wearing a Rolex Oyster Perpetual in his netting. Thanks to Rolex's immaculate record of purchases and service dates, as well as multiple day power reserve in the watch itself, authorities were able to narrow down the exact date that Ronald Platt was murdered and why. And this story is kind of crazy. So Platt was a TV repairman who befriended a bad person at an even worse time. Ontario financial consultant Albert Johnson Walker fled to England with his daughter who posed as his wife. After embezzling $3.2 million of his client's money, befriending Platt and even starting a business with him, Walker capitalized on Platt's desire to return to Canada. where he was also from, and told Platt to return. When he left, Walker reportedly stole his identity, then panicked when Platt returned a few short years later. He murdered the repairman while out on his yacht at sea, tying an anchor around the body and dumping him overboard. He's now serving a life sentence for murder in Ontario. And another story from that same article, I call this one the Plagiarizing Watchmaker. And you've probably heard of this brand. Engineered to evoke its wearer to live life to the fullest because it's finite and will all die eventually. In case you needed reminding, the ticker watch takes the concept of carpe diem to the extreme and calculates approximately how long you have left to live on Earth. It's meant to encourage you to live every moment to its fullest and not waste a single second. But the story behind the watch creator and his activities are pretty crazy. Ticker is a Kickstarter made legitimate by creator Frederick Colting, but he has hobbies outside of watchmaking, including plagiarizing and repurposing some of the world's most revered and classic works. Colting's pen name is John David California, and he's been sued for publishing everything from children's versions of Breakfast at Tiffany's, The Old Man and the Sea, On the Road, to writing an unauthorized sequel to The Catcher in the Rye. And he didn't even bother changing the titles on the books. The last one that I have comes from GearPatrol.com, and I'm calling this one The Actual Watch. This one isn't really a story, it's an interview, but there are some crazy stories in this interview. So the Paul Newman Daytona reference 6239 has been owned by James Cox since 1984, and he'll be selling it, and estimates on what it may go for go as high as $10 million. He tells the story of when the watch was given to him. I was 18 years old and working for Paul, helping him build the treehouse. This was a summer job, so I could make some money for college. I think Paul had thought it out beforehand. He was the kind of guy that rolled so cool and so apparently spontaneous that I think in this particular case, when I came over, he fully had the intention of giving me the watch. You know, he was an actor and he could just make this environment super cool, whether he had scripted this or actually forgotten to wind it. He asked me for the time, and I said I don't have a watch. I don't know what time it is. And that's when he said, if you remember to wind this, it tells pretty good time. And then he handed it to me. And there's Paul. You know, he may not have wound it the day before so that this would play well, or it could have been spontaneous. But I think the gift was genuine. He spent some time showing me how to roll the winder and screw it down, and he did try to explain that it was a chronograph, a timepiece great for racing. When you look at photos of Paul racing, he's always got the sleeves rolled up, so he's really using it. This Daytona was used in that way and was important to Paul when he was racing, which maybe makes it even more special that he gave it to me. He also discusses when he realized just how special this watch is. I think it was when I had gone to an outdoor retailer trade show in the early 90s. A Japanese guy who didn't speak much English saw my watch and said, "Paul Newman watch, Paul Newman watch." And I said, "Yeah, Paul Newman's watch." And he couldn't communicate well enough to move beyond that back and forth. And I thought, man, how does this guy know this is Paul Newman's watch? Then a few years later, I was walking by a Rolex dealer in Monterey, and there's a guy standing outside with a Rolex lab coat on, smoking a cigarette, and in the window were a couple Daytonas. I asked him, what's the retail on those Daytonas? He looks at me and says, oh, well, it's probably $60,000 to $70,000 on that one, and we have a few more Paul Newmans in the back. And that was my second clue, that these guys are calling the watch a Paul Newman. So that's when I started putting it together. I asked, what if you had a Paul Newman's actual watch? What would that be worth? And he said maybe $300,000. So then he discusses how heavy the responsibility became after that. I think to own this thing, it became a responsibility once I realized how important it was to the watch world and how iconic it was. That was 6 or 7 years ago. I said, wow, I need to put this thing in a safe deposit box and be careful with it. We've all heard stories where someone had some special car in their garage and didn't know it, or there's this very valuable thing that appears in the marketplace, and sometimes the people aren't aware of the backstory or how amazing it is. Those stories sound really crazy to me, yet I'm one of those stories now, and it's just hard to kind of get a handle on it. I think it's because it's such a personal item for me that has helped to keep it more grounded. That was a super interesting interview, and you can read it in its entirety. The links to all of these articles and threads are in the description below. Thanks for watching.